10 British legends of the 70s whose fame turned into horror. The 1970s were Britain's golden era of music and entertainment, a time when glittering musicians, beloved comedians, and unforgettable voices defined an entire generation. But behind the flashing lights, adoring fans, and sold-out shows, a darker story was unfolding. Some of the decade's brightest stars were living on borrowed time, haunted by hidden demons, fatal accidents, and shocking betrayals. From Marc Bolan's premonition of a car accident that would claim his life, to Sid Vicious's tragic romance ending in double heartbreak, these stories reveal the terrifying price of fame. Some deaths were eerily coincidental, like two legends lost in the same bedroom, while others were heartbreakingly preventable, highlighting the fragile line between stardom and catastrophe. By the end of this video, you'll uncover secrets and shocking truths about 10 icons whose talent lit up the world, but whose lives were tragically cut short. Stick with us until the end, and don't forget to subscribe to Vintage Uncovered. You won't believe what fate had in store for these stars. Marc Bolan, the glam rock king who predicted his own death. Marc Bolan didn't just influence glam rock, he invented it. Born Mark Feld in London, he transformed himself into the electric warrior who would define the early 1970s. With his band T-Rex, he created a phenomenon the British press dubbed T-Rextasy, drawing comparisons to Beatlemania. His corkscrew curls, feather boas, and glittering personas brought magic to Britain's gray streets, producing anthems that remain radio staples decades later. But beneath the swagger and top hats existed a man haunted by a dark premonition. Bolan frequently confided to friends and family that he didn't expect to live to old age. This wasn't casual pessimism, it was a shadow that followed him even at the peak of his fame. The cruel irony of Bolan's story centers on automobiles. Despite owning a luxurious collection of vehicles, including a white Rolls-Royce, he never learned to drive. He was terrified of it, convinced that a car would be the instrument of his death. This phobia meant he relied entirely on others for transportation, believing this caution would protect him from the dark vision in his mind. His fear proved prophetic. In the early morning hours of September 16, 1977, Bolan was returning from a celebration at a Mayfair restaurant. He sat as a passenger in a purple Mini 1275 GT driven by his partner, Gloria Jones. Just miles from his home on a quiet road in Barnes, southwest London, the car left the road, crashed through a fence, and collided with a large sycamore tree. Marc Bolan died instantly, just 2 weeks before his 30th birthday. The news devastated the British music industry. Fans who had grown up with his posters covering their bedroom walls wept openly. His funeral drew fellow icons David Bowie and Rod Stewart, who stood in somber silence as a large floral tribute shaped like a swan was displayed. The sycamore tree in Barnes became an instant shrine, a pilgrimage site that draws visitors to this day. Bolan's death marked more than the loss of a musician. It represented the symbolic end of the glittering, innocent optimism of the early 1970s. As punk rock's aggression began dominating the charts, losing Bolan felt like the lights being turned off at a wonderful party. He left behind a young son, a catalog of timeless hits, and a legacy proving some stars burn too bright to last forever. Sid Vicious, punk's poster boy, and his doomed romance. If Marc Bolan represented the glittery dream of the 70s, Sid Vicious embodied the rude awakening. Born John Simon Ritchie, he became the sneering face of punk revolution, famous not for musical talent, but for attitude and his ultimate descent into darkness. Joining the Sex Pistols in 1977 as replacement bassist, Sid couldn't play well, but he possessed the perfect look of rebellion. His spiked hair, padlock necklace, and constant sneer made him the poster boy for a generation wanting to tear down the establishment. Behind the leather jacket, however, was a vulnerable, confused young man, hopelessly searching for connection in a world that only wanted to exploit his image. His life changed when he met Nancy Spungen, an American girl. Their relationship was intense, volatile, and ultimately catastrophic. They became inseparable, clinging to each other as they fell deeper into dangerous chemical dependency. To the press, they were punk rock's Romeo and Juliet. Behind closed doors, their life was a cycle of despair and heavy substance abuse. After the Sex Pistols disintegrated during a disastrous American tour, Sid and Nancy moved to New York City's Chelsea Hotel, famous for harboring artists and eccentrics. In Room 100, their story moved toward its heartbreaking conclusion, surrounded by confusion and toxic habits. On the morning of October 12, 1978, hotel staff discovered Nancy lifeless in the bathroom from a fatal injury. Sid was immediately detained by police. The young musician was in complete shock, seemingly unable to remember the previous night's events due to heavy intoxication. He was charged with the most serious crime imaginable, the taking of another life. Debate continues decades later whether it was accident, tragic pact, or misunderstanding gone wrong. Sid was released on bail but remained a broken man, haunted by losing the only person who truly understood him. Less than 4 months later, on February 2, 1979, Sid attended a small gathering celebrating his prison release. At just 21 years old, with his whole life ahead, the sorrow he carried proved too heavy. That night, he made a fatal error with the substances he consumed. The next morning, his mother found him deceased in his sleep, joining his beloved Nancy. His death marked the definitive end of Britain's initial punk explosion. Sid Vicious's tragedy extends beyond a young life lost. It stands as a stark reminder of how the music industry can consume its own creations. He was a boy who wanted to be a star, but lacked the support system to handle the pressure. Instead of help, he found enablers. Instead of guidance, chaos. Today, his image still appears on tourist t-shirts in London, but few consider the sad, lonely boy behind the sneer who never made it to his 22nd birthday. The ultimate cautionary tale of the 1970s, symbolizing wasted youth and fame's destructive power without protection. Of Pete Ham, destroyed by the man sworn to protect him. While some stars fought chemical dependency or fame's pressures, Pete Ham was destroyed by the very people sworn to protect him. His story represents arguably the most heartbreaking betrayal in British music history. As leader of Badfinger, Pete was a sensitive, incredibly talented songwriter hand-picked by the Beatles to carry the torch of melodic rock into the new decade. With hits like Day After Day and Baby Blue, the band seemed destined for global superstardom. Pete even co-wrote Without You, which became a #1 hit for Harry Nilsson and later Mariah Carey, generating millions in royalties. Despite his songs conquering the world, Pete Ham lived in growing financial panic. The villain was manager Stan Polly, a smooth-talking American businessman who promised to handle the band's finances, setting up complex accounts and companies the young musicians didn't understand. Pete, a trusting soul who only cared about music, believed his future was secure. By spring 1975, Pete had bought a house in Surrey and was expecting a child with his partner. But when he tried accessing his own money to pay bills, he found the funds unreachable. The band had been touring constantly and selling records by the truckload, yet they were penniless. The harsh reality slowly dawned. Millions they'd earned had vanished into a labyrinth of corruption orchestrated by the man they trusted. The situation became critical in April 1975. Pete attempted contacting his manager, desperate for explanation and means to support his growing family. But calls went unanswered. The pressure on the 27-year-old was unbearable. He felt deep shame and hopelessness, believing he'd let everyone down. The industry that should have celebrated his genius had instead stripped him of dignity. On the night of April 23rd, after an evening of drinking and dwelling on the betrayal, Pete made a tragic decision that would silence his golden voice forever. He was found the next morning in his garage studio, having chosen to leave this world by his own hand. Beside him was a note revealing the depth of his despair. In his final written words, he expressed that he wouldn't be allowed to love and trust everybody, stating this was the better option. He also left a scathing final sentence directed at his manager, calling him a soulless individual responsible for his fate. It was a devastating end for a man who had brought so much joy through his melodies. Badfinger's tragedy didn't end there. The financial ruin caused by management continued haunting surviving members for years. In a grim echo, Pete's bandmate and close friend Tom Evans would eventually meet a similar fate years later, unable to cope with the same legal and financial battles. Pete Ham remains a member of the tragic 27 Club, but unlike others who died from excess, he was a victim of corporate greed. His story serves as a permanent, sorrowful reminder to all young artists. Richard Beckinsale, the beloved comedian, stolen by nature. While rock stars of the 1970s flirted with danger and lived on the edge, Richard Beckinsale was the wholesome, lovable face of British television. He wasn't a rebel or outcast. He was the boy with doe eyes and a gentle smile who charmed the entire nation. Rising to fame in two of the decade's most successful sitcoms, Rising Damp and Porridge, he proved himself a comic genius with rare ability to make audiences laugh while pulling at their heartstrings. As Lenny Godber, the naive prison inmate, he held his own against comedy giants like Ronnie Barker, becoming a household name before reaching his 30th birthday. To the public, he was the picture of youth and vitality, a rising star with decades of success ahead. Fate had a cruel twist in store that no one, not even his doctors, could have predicted. In early 1979, Richard was working on a new sitcom called Bloomers. Outwardly, he appeared fit and healthy, maintaining a busy filming and family schedule with his wife Judy Lowe and their 5-year-old daughter Kate. Yet in the days leading up to tragedy, he'd complained of feeling unusually tired and experiencing arm aches, symptoms dismissed as simple fatigue from overwork. He even joked about his health with colleagues, unaware his body was hiding a silent, deadly condition. On his final day on set, he was his usual cheerful self, bringing laughter to the crew before heading home for what should have been a restful night. On the morning of March 19, 1979, the unthinkable happened. Richard didn't wake up. He had passed away in his sleep from a massive heart attack caused by a congenital defect that had gone undetected his entire life. He was just 31 years old. The news hit Britain like a physical blow. It seemed impossible that someone so young, making millions laugh on television screens just days before, was gone. The shock was compounded by bitter irony. He played the youthful counterpart to older characters in his shows, yet he was taken first. The grief outpouring was immense. His co-star and mentor Ronnie Barker was reportedly devastated, unable to speak to press for days. The tragedy left a void in British comedy never quite filled. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect was the family he left behind. His young daughter, Kate Beckinsale, would grow up to become a Hollywood superstar, carrying her father's legacy forward, though she's often spoken of the profound loss at such a tender age. Richard Beckinsale's death remains one of the 1970s entertainment world's most poignant moments. He didn't die from rock and roll excesses or high-speed crashes. He was simply stolen away by nature in the prime of life. His reruns still air today, keeping his memory alive, but watching them brings bittersweet feeling. We see a young man full of life and promise, frozen in time, reminding us that tomorrow is never promised, no matter how bright the future looks. Keith Moon, the wild drummer, and the cursed. Bedroom. In the pantheon of rock and roll excess, Keith Moon stands as the undisputed king of chaos. The Who's drummer wasn't just a musician, he was a force of nature. Known as Moon the Loon, he was famous for driving cars into swimming pools, destroying hotel rooms with explosives, and living life at a speed that terrified ordinary people. Behind the drum kit, he was a genius, playing with ferocity that defined the British invasion sound. But the Clown Prince of Rock used eccentric behavior to mask deep, crippling insecurity and severe reliance on alcohol to function socially. By the late 1970s, the party was winding down, and the toll on his body was becoming painfully visible. By 1978, Keith was just 32, but looked decades older. He'd gained significant weight and struggled to keep up with the physical demands of his own music. Desperate to get his life back on track and marry his fiancée Annette, he decided to fight his demons. He wanted to get sober. To assist with this difficult journey, a doctor prescribed heminevrin, a powerful sedative intended to curb alcohol cravings. The tragedy lies in Keith trying to save himself, but the very medicine meant to be his cure became his undoing. He was a man of extremes who didn't understand that taking more medication wouldn't make him better faster. It would prove fatal. On the evening of September 6, 1978, Keith attended a party hosted by Paul McCartney celebrating Buddy Holly's legacy. Guests later recalled Keith seemed different, relatively calm, telling friends he was planning to settle down. After the event, he returned to the flat he was renting in Mayfair at number 12 Curzon Place. This location already held a dark reputation in the music world. It was owned by singer Harry Nilsson, and 4 years earlier, the Mamas and the Papas star Cass Elliot had passed away in the exact same bedroom. Keith took a handful of his prescribed tablets, hoping to suppress anxiety and get sleep. He never woke up. The official verdict ruled his passing as accidental. He had taken 32 tablets, a lethal dose that overwhelmed his system. The irony was heartbreaking. The man who had survived years of reckless driving, high falls, and dangerous stunts died from a prescription drug while trying to get clean. His death devastated his bandmates, particularly Pete Townshend, and effectively ended The Who's classic era. The rhythm section that had powered the mod generation was silenced forever. Keith Moon's story is often retold as funny anecdotes about smashed guitars and hovercrafts, but the ending is profoundly sad, revealing the loneliness of the class clown who feels he must always perform, even when hurting inside. The spooky coincidence of his death occurring in the same room as Cass Elliot led Harry Nilsson to sell the property, convinced it was cursed. Today, Keith is remembered as the greatest drummer in rock history, on a wild comet that burned out because the world was simply too small to contain his energy. Sandy Denny, the folk queen's preventable tragedy. In a decade dominated by loud guitars and aggressive rock stars, one voice possessed a haunting, ethereal quality capable of silencing a rowdy crowd in seconds. Sandy Denny was widely considered Britain's preeminent folk rock singer, a woman with talent so immense she remains the only guest vocalist to ever appear on a Led Zeppelin studio album. With her band Fairport Convention and later as a solo artist, she wrote songs like Who Knows Where the Time Goes, displaying wisdom and melancholy far beyond her years. To fans, she was an Earth Mother figure, a symbol of pastoral beauty and artistic purity. And the reality of her daily existence was a turbulent storm of insecurity and self-destruction, standing in stark contrast to her music's serenity. Sandy struggled immensely with music industry pressures. She was plagued by deep-seated doubts about her appearance and worth, fears she attempted to drown in liquid courage. Her chaotic lifestyle became legendary within the London music scene, but it wasn't glamorous rock and roll. It was a cry for help. By the late 1970s, her behavior had become erratic, driving a wedge between her and friends, straining her marriage to fellow musician Trevor Lucas. Despite the birth of her daughter Georgia in 1977, Sandy couldn't escape the dark clouds that followed her. She was a fragile soul trying to navigate a world demanding strength she didn't possess. The sequence of events leading to her demise is truly tragic because it was so preventable. In March 1978, while on holiday in Cornwall with her family, Sandy suffered a fall down a staircase, hitting her head on the stone floor. Perhaps due to her state or fear of doctors, she didn't seek immediate medical attention. She believed she'd simply bruised herself and carried on, unaware a ticking time bomb had been set off inside her. Weeks later, back in London, headaches began intensifying, but the situation's severity went unnoticed amidst the general chaos of her life. Her husband, fearing for their child's safety due to Sandy's unpredictable moods, had left for Australia with their daughter, leaving Sandy alone in a friend's home. On April 17, 1978, Sandy was found unconscious at a friend's house. She had collapsed into a coma from which she would never wake. The Cornwall fall had caused a traumatic brain injury that slowly worsened over time. She passed away 4 days later at Atkinson Morley Hospital in Wimbledon. She was only 31 years old. The tragic irony was that she sang so often about time's passage and life's fleeting nature, yet was denied the chance to see her own daughter grow up. Her funeral was a somber affair attended by British folk scene royalty, left reeling from the loss. For years, her death was whispered about as a warning against excess dangers. Today, we recognize it as a heartbreaking failure of support for a woman who gave so much to the world. Sandy Denny left behind a music catalog that sounds as fresh and painful today as it did 50 years ago. She was a shooting star who fell to earth, a victim of a simple accident that turned fatal because no one was there to catch her. Her epitaph reads, "The Lady," a simple title for a complex woman whose voice still echoes in music history halls. Leslie Harvey, Death by a Loose Wire. When we think of dangers facing 1970s rock stars, we usually imagine fast cars, private jets, or illicit substances. For one talented Scottish musician, the danger was lurking in the very tools of his trade. Leslie Harvey was the gifted guitarist for blues rock band Stone the Crows, a group tipped for massive international success. Managed by legendary Peter Grant, the same man who guided Led Zeppelin to global domination, the band possessed a raw, gritty sound perfectly suited to the era. Leslie wasn't just a musician. He was the heartbeat of the group and romantic partner of the band's powerhouse vocalist, Maggie Bell. Together, they were an electric duo, captivating audiences with chemistry and passion. As the band took the stage for soundcheck and setup, the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Leslie, with his guitar strapped around his shoulder, or walked up to a microphone stand to make an announcement or perhaps adjust his position, a routine action he'd performed 1,000 times before. In a horrifying instant, the circuit was completed. Due to a fault in the ungrounded equipment, high-voltage current surged through the metal strings of his guitar and the microphone. Leslie was electrocuted in front of his bandmates and the gathering crowd. At first, there was confusion. Some audience members reportedly thought it was a dramatic stunt, part of the performance designed to shock them. But the reality was far more grim. His fellow musicians and road crew rushed to help, frantically trying to break the connection, but the electrical force was too strong. By the time he was freed and rushed to the hospital, it was too late. Leslie Harvey was pronounced deceased at the tragic age of 27. The impact on the British music community was profound. It highlighted the terrifying lack of safety standards in venues across the country. A young man with the world at his feet had been taken away simply because of a loose wire and a wet stage. They attempted to continue with a replacement guitarist, but the heart had been ripped out of the band. The grief was too heavy, and the group eventually dissolved, leaving behind a legacy of what might have been. Leslie Harvey is often remembered as a member of the 27 Club, but unlike others who courted danger, he was an innocent victim of negligence. His story is a chilling reminder of the physical perils of rock's golden age. Every time a modern musician steps on stage with safe, wireless equipment, they owe a small debt to past tragedies that forced the industry to change. Leslie's final chord was never played, but the silence he left behind still resonates as one of music history's most freakish and sorrowful accidents. Paul Kossoff, the blues guitar soul who couldn't be saved. In British rock history, there are guitarists who play fast, and then there are guitarists who play with their soul. Paul Kossoff was undoubtedly the latter. As lead guitarist for the band Free, he was a child prodigy who possessed a vibrato so emotional and distinct it could make a grown man cry. The son of beloved actor David Kossoff, Paul was a sensitive, artistic young man who found his voice through the strings of his Les Paul guitar. And when the band released their global anthem, All Right Now, in 1970, Paul was barely out of his teens, yet already being hailed as a blues master. While the music was triumphant, the man behind the instrument was crumbling under the weight of his own sensitivity. Unlike the hedonistic partying of his peers, Paul's descent into chemical dependency was driven by deep, aching sadness. He struggled immensely with touring pressures and internal conflicts that eventually tore Free apart. When the group dissolved, Paul took it as personal rejection, a heartbreak from which he never truly recovered. He began to self-medicate with powerful sedatives, substances that numbed his pain but slowly destroyed his coordination and health. It was painful for friends to watch. The man who once made his guitar sing could sometimes barely hold a plectrum. And in 1975, he technically passed away for 35 minutes after a severe episode, but was miraculously revived by doctors. It was a warning sign from the universe, but tragically, the grip of addiction was too strong to break. By 1976, Paul was attempting a comeback with a new band, Backstreet Crawler. He was trying to regain his footing in the world, touring America, and hoping to find the spark that had made him a legend. However, his body was exhausted. On March 19, 1976, Paul boarded a flight from Los Angeles to New York. He seemed in good spirits, chatting with those around him. But as the plane cruised over the Atlantic, Paul fell into a sleep from which he would not wake. He suffered a pulmonary embolism, a direct consequence of his weakened physical state. And the flight crew discovered that the 25-year-old star had quietly slipped away at 30,000 feet. The news was greeted with a wave of sorrow back in Britain. His father, David Kossoff, later established a foundation in his son's name to help fight the scourge of addiction, turning private grief into a public crusade. Paul's death wasn't just the loss of a musician, it was the loss of a unique voice that has never been replicated. He didn't need 1,000 notes to impress an audience. He needed only one, played with enough feeling to stop time. Today, Paul Kossoff is remembered as the tragic angel of the blues. His grave is marked with a simple plaque, but his legacy lives on every time All Right Now plays on the radio. He serves as a poignant reminder that immense talent often comes with immense fragility, and that sometimes the people who bring the most joy to the world are the ones suffering the most in silence. Nick Drake, The Whisper. No one heard. In the noisy, flamboyant landscape of the 1970s, where success was measured in decibels and glitter, there was one artist who whispered instead of shouting. Nick Drake's story is perhaps the most poignant example of the misunderstood genius in British cultural history. Born into an upper-middle-class family and educated at Cambridge University, Nick was a tall, handsome young man who seemed to have every advantage in life. He possessed a guitar technique that was utterly unique and a voice that sounded like autumn leaves falling on a quiet street. Behind his gentle demeanor lay paralyzing shyness and deepening melancholy that would eventually consume him completely. Yet he wasn't built for the cutthroat world of music business. He was a poet who simply wanted his songs to be heard, but the world wasn't ready to listen. During his short career, Nick released 3 albums: 5 Leaves Left, Brighter Later, and Pink Moon. Today, these records are considered masterpieces, treasured by millions of fans and cited as influences by the biggest bands in the world. But in the early 1970s, they were commercial failures, selling fewer than 5,000 copies upon release. Nick, desperate for connection, took this indifference as personal rejection. He refused to give interviews or perform live, retreating further into his own shell. His final album, Pink Moon, recorded in 2 short nights, is a stark, stripped-back document of a mind unraveling. It's just a man and his guitar, just stripping away all layers until only raw, painful truth remained. By 1974, the 26-year-old musician had abandoned London and retreated to his parents' home, a secluded house called Far Leys in the Warwickshire countryside. He had ceased to function as a professional artist. Friends described him as unrecognizable. He would sit for hours in silence, staring at the wall, trapped in a fortress of inner darkness. He felt like a failure, a burden to his family, and a ghost in his own life. It's heartbreaking to imagine a man of such immense talent sitting in a small room believing his art meant nothing to anyone. On the morning of November 25, 1974, his mother went into his room to wake him, only to find him lying across his bed. He had passed away during the night from an overdose of a prescribed antidepressant called tryptizol. To this day, it remains a mystery whether it was a deliberate decision to leave this world or a tragic accident caused by desperate need for sleep. There was no note, only a book on his bedside table about the myth of Sisyphus. He was just 26 years old. At the time of his passing, his death was barely noticed by the music press. The true tragedy of Nick Drake is the irony of his afterlife. Decades later, his music was used in a car commercial, sparking a global revival that turned him into an icon. Today, his grave is a site of pilgrimage, and his records sell more copies in a month than they did in his entire lifetime. He achieved the immortality he craved, but he wasn't there to see it. His story serves as a somber lesson about artists' fragility and the importance of kindness. We'll never know what other songs he had inside him, only that the world was too loud for such a quiet soul. Ian Curtis, the poet who lost control. For our final story, we travel to the grey industrial streets of Manchester to meet a young man whose shadow looms larger than perhaps any other figure in British alternative music. Ian Curtis, the enigmatic frontman of Joy Division, was the poet laureate of urban decay. In the late 1970s, while others were screaming in anger, Ian was looking inward, exploring the desolate landscapes of the human soul with a baritone voice that sounded like it came from the bottom of a well. On stage, his performance was mesmerizing and frightening. He would dance with a frantic, jerky intensity that mirrored the epileptic seizures he suffered from in real life. To the audience, it was art. To Ian, it was a physical manifestation of the loss of control that defined his existence. Behind the brooding mystique lay a 23-year-old man rapidly losing his grip on reality. Ian had been diagnosed with severe epilepsy at a time when medical treatment for the condition was primitive and brutal. The heavy medication he was prescribed caused extreme mood swings, leaving him in constant exhaustion and depression. He was trapped in a vicious cycle. The flashing lights of the stage triggered his seizures, yet the stage was the only place where he felt truly alive. Furthermore, his personal life was collapsing under the weight of his own guilt. He was torn between loyalty to his wife Deborah and their baby daughter and an intense affair with a Belgian journalist named Annick. The lyrics he wrote during this period, particularly for the song "Love Will Tear Us Apart," weren't just artistic expressions. They were literal cries for help, documenting the disintegration of his spirit. By May 1980, Joy Division was on the brink of global stardom. They were scheduled to fly to America for their first transatlantic tour, a journey that would likely have made them household names. But for Ian, the prospect of the tour wasn't an opportunity. It was a terrifying sentence. He was petrified that his health wouldn't hold up, that he would let everyone down, and that he could no longer maintain the facade of the rock star. On the evening of May 17th, he returned to his home in Macclesfield to persuade his estranged wife to drop divorce proceedings. When she left, while he spent the night alone watching a film by Werner Herzog called Stroszek and listening to The Idiot by Iggy Pop. It was a lonely vigil in a quiet house with the pressure of the world resting on his shoulders. In the early hours of May 18, 1980, just hours before he was due to board the plane to New York, Ian Curtis made the tragic decision to end his pain. He was found later that morning by his wife, having taken his own life in the kitchen. He was only 23. The news stopped the British music world in its tracks. The band, which had been poised to conquer the world, immediately ceased to exist as Joy Division, eventually reforming as New Order. The tragedy of Ian Curtis is the ultimate story of the tortured artist, but it's also a story about the failure of the medical and support systems of the 1970s. He was a young man dealing with a neurological disease and profound depression, treated with pills that made him worse and pushed into a spotlight that burned him. His tombstone in Macclesfield bears the inscription of his most famous song title. Every time we hear that haunting synthesizer melody, we're reminded of the fragile boy who gave everything he had to the music until he had nothing left to give to himself. His passing marked the definitive end of the 70s post-punk era and the beginning of a darker, more introspective decade. These 10 tragic stories from Britain's 1970s reveal more than individual losses. They expose systemic failures in an industry that consumed its brightest stars. From Mark Bolan's prophetic fear of cars to Leslie Harvey's death from basic safety negligence, from Pete Ham's financial betrayal to Nick Drake's unheard genius, each story carries lessons that resonate today. The 1970s gave us extraordinary music, groundbreaking performances, and cultural moments that defined a generation. But it also took 10 brilliant lives before their time, artists who deserved protection, support, and the chance to grow old. Their music remains a bittersweet reminder of talents extinguished too soon and the price of fame in an era when nobody was watching out for the stars themselves.